So we're going to get started, and I want to start off what I've been doing. For those people who have been following the panels that I've moderated, you'll know that I've started off every time with why I'm here, and it's always been a different reason. So you're going to start to wonder why I'm really here. But I have another reason for why I'm here today, and I'm going to introduce myself that way in the panel, and then I'm going to ask our participants to take a minute or two and introduce themselves and explain also why they're here. And for me, what got me interested in this issue of climate policy is I made a discovery of shale gas in Quebec that we've now got some pretty good numbers that shows it'll reduce no less than a megaton of carbon in Canada, and perhaps 2 megatons of carbon, but somewhere a significant amount of net carbon. And I thought I had the world's best project. It's going to make a massive change to environment, to air quality. It's going to improve air quality. It's going to improve emissions. It's going to improve the economy. And I thought I might even be, get the hero of Quebec for making this discovery, until I met the environmental movement in Quebec, who said, well, we don't really care about that because you're going to increase Quebec emissions and you're going to decrease Alberta and BC emissions, and we only care about Quebec emissions. And they have been against my project from day one. This is 2011 that I've learned this. And I've been talking about this issue for a while, but it wasn't until I was in the energy policy discussions in Quebec where a Norwegian fellow presented to us about climate policy and energy efficiency and so on and so forth. And he made 2 very important points as a pro-carbon pricing and pro-climate observer. He says, when you're making your policy, be careful of 2 very important things. Don't allow your policy to increase energy poverty, and don't allow your policy to create massive carbon leaks. And I learned a word, and this is some years ago, and that word I think we're all starting to learn more, carbon leaks. But that's why I'm here, is that I think we need to find a environmentally friendly policy that doesn't stop projects that reduce emissions. So that's why I'm here. And before I let you introduce yourselves, I want to talk on that basis about the frame of today's discussion for people, because we had a debate last time with Mark and David, and I thought it was a very interesting debate, but I don't want to have I'm hoping not to have a debate today at all, actually. And I'd like to have a discussion, maybe one of the first from people in the conservative movement who know about this issue, about what are our policy options to have more economic activity and less emissions. That's the discussion I'm hoping to have today. And so I'm going to take 2 issues off the table so that we don't get into the debate we had last year. And one issue is the idea that climate change is not real, the globe isn't really warming, that this is not an issue. And I'm not saying that isn't worth discussing somewhere by somebody, but there's certainly no point in having a policy discussion about emissions if you don't even believe there's a problem. So I want to just take that issue out. And for those who object to that, I'll make a point for you. I'm in the oil and gas business. I think oil and gas is way too valuable a product to waste it. So why wouldn't we reduce emissions no matter what we believe in, right? The other issue I want to take off the table is the pragmatic, the polls say, 6 out of 10 millennials say, we have no choice. If we want to get elected, we have to do it. Because that's not really a policy discussion either, that's a pollster discussion. So I've talked to the panelists, they've all agreed to take those 2 issues off the table and try to have a discussion about the policy options between those 2 places. So with that beginning, I'm going to turn it to Dave to tell us why you're here.
Well, thanks, Michael. David McLaughlin. I just recently finished a little jaunt in Manitoba, senior advisor to the Premier on climate change, and led the effort to develop Manitoba's policy in this area, which makes us, at this moment, although I'm no longer working with them, so I will say we and us, I can't help it, makes us the only conservative government, party, and leader that actually has a climate plan with carbon pricing in it, yes, but other things as well. So we tried to find a way to tackle this and have wrestled with, frankly, the policy questions that we're going to try to discuss today. So I want to bring some of that experience of what we did in Manitoba and see if there's a path forward for us through some of the trade-offs, through some of the considerations that we've done. Other political policy experience I won't bore you with, but there you are.
Okay, thank you. Mark.
I'm Mark Cameron. I'm the Executive Director of Canadians for Clean Prosperity, which is a not-for-profit organization that works to bring about economically friendly solutions, market-friendly solutions to environmental challenges. My background is primarily in government and conservative politics here in the Hill. I was 3 years in Prime Minister Harper's office as Director of Policy and Research. Have also done a lot in the sort of energy and climate space, worked for Ontario Power Generation for a while and as a consultant with a number of energy clients. So I've always been really interested in this issue of getting the balance right between energy development and protecting the environment and dealing with climate issues.
Okay, fantastic. Jeff.
Jeff Golan, I'm the Vice President at the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and obviously very concerned about this issue, given the facts that governments are taking policies that are adding cost and uncertainty to an industry that's very globally competitive, where we fight for capital every day around the world. And the impacts that government policy can have on our industry and the hundreds of thousands of Canadians that rely on their jobs and supporting their families is very significant for us. And we look at it that Canadian oil and natural gas should be the last barrel used on the earth, not the first one taken out. So when we look at what the concerns about carbon leakage and capital leakage that can come with that, we're very interested to play our part, but not to be put at a competitive advantage around the world.
Okay. Ed.
My name is Ed Fast. I'm the Conservative Party's Shadow Minister for Environment and Climate Change. Obviously, we're facing some significant issues, grappling with them in Parliament. This week, as many of you know, the government came forward with amendments to the Canadian environmental assessment process and some of the related legislation, such as the Navigable Waters Act and the Fisheries Act. And we as Conservatives, I believe we have a good story to tell on the environment, especially when it comes to conservation. But we also have to come forward with a policy platform that is defensible, that is based in science, and that meets the needs of the future. So I'm hoping this discussion will help me in that process.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I would like to start the discussion where I feel the debate ended last year, and I'm more than happy if you feel my summary is biased and wrong. You're more than happy to correct me, but I'll try to do a fair job. I feel where we ended up last year was a discussion of the pluses and minuses of carbon taxes, and the idea that if the minuses are bigger than the pluses, then doing nothing was the right answer. And I think the other point was say, well, doing nothing is not a possible answer, and what's your alternative if it isn't a carbon tax? So that is what I felt the summary was, and I don't want to be unfairly, would you?
No,
Okay, so that caused me to think a lot. I had thought about one thing which I'd thrown out at the time, consumption-based or border adjustment tax as one of the alternatives.
Yes.
I threw that out in that debate, but I've had a chance to look at this in more detail over the last year. And so before we talk, and I think we should talk a little bit about the pluses and minuses of a carbon tax again, but I'd like, because most of the people I talk to go, well, there is no other option. There's only carbon taxes and nothing. And that's most conservatives that I talk to think it's only carbon taxes or nothing. And so I guess I would open it up with the first question is, I think all of us realize that there are more options. So I'm going to open the first question is, why do we think we haven't bothered to talk about anything other than the Liberal proposal of carbon taxes as Conservatives?
Start?
You go ahead.
Two reasons. One's policy and one's politics. The policy of it is, as Conservatives, the tax route is always the last resort route. So if the last barrel of oil is the last policy we ever want to do. Like we're low tax folks, right, or no tax folks. The politics of it is we had a pretty successful election in 2008. The two Stevens, Stephen and Stefan, on this issue. And it has politicized and polarized around this with it for Conservatives because of the incredible success of the way the party was able to label that Liberal proposal and on top. And I just as I look back analytically, it has cascaded through and trickled down. So it has helped shape the way that we look at this issue. We have to get away from that, I think, because it binds us into kinds of options and a way of looking at this that is not helpful politically. I won't go the pollster route, but actually limits our policy choices. So in Manitoba, yes, we have carbon pricing, a flat tax of $25 a ton proposed over 5 years for our plan. It will reduce emissions by, it'll account for only half of the projected emission reductions. We're not putting all our eggs in that basket, and we shouldn't. The reason why is at a certain point for Manitoba's energy economy, being clean, it's not cost effective. It doesn't make sense. You add $50 a ton or 60 or $70 a ton, you get smaller incremental or marginal emission reduction. So the tool is useful, but to a point.
Right.
So then you look at other measures. So then it's regulatory measures, clean energy standards. There's certain things you can do in terms of building codes, regulatory pieces that government and private sector can do to get emissions down where they count in certain sectors. So if we want to do this, let's do it right. Let's do it pragmatically. I think we should look at carbon pricing to the extent it can help. But the idea that we should put all our eggs in that basket and just do that is, I think, when I hear that from the left, I think that's wrong. I hear it from another side, it's just policy terms. It wouldn't have worked in Manitoba. Why would it work necessarily elsewhere? There are other tools. Think about them, use them.
In the Conservative caucus, are people talking about the other alternatives to a carbon tax and doing nothing?
Definitely. My role is to make sure that as we move forward with developing a policy on the environment writ large, more specifically on the issue of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions writ large, again, we've been consulting heavily already within caucus. We have established a process in which we are consulting stakeholders right across our economy. I believe over the last 2 years we've consulted about 200 stakeholders. We want to make sure we get this right. The one thing we will not move forward with is a carbon tax. Mark and I have had wonderful discussions about this. In fact, he has challenged me to reevaluate carbon taxes as being part of the toolkit that we as Conservatives should use. And my challenge is this: in a purely theoretical world, in a perfect world, a carbon tax regime may work, especially if it's revenue neutral. The problem is we function in a world, in a political world. I'm an actor within that world. There are many that are active in that. They're the ones that make the decisions. As revenues roll into government from carbon taxes, they are either returned to the taxpayers, corporate taxpayers, individual taxpayers, or the money is directed elsewhere, maybe towards environmental initiatives, but more often than not, towards political initiatives that reflect the political interest of the party that's in power. And so the suggestion that we have a carbon tax regime that isn't going to hurt the taxpayer, I think is something that belongs to a theoretical discussion. I don't believe it plays out in the real world. And we see an example of that in British Columbia, my home province, where for a number of years we had a carbon tax that was, for the most part, revenue neutral. Now we had a change in government, and one of the first policy initiatives of the NDP government was to eliminate the revenue neutrality of the carbon tax. So now that money, anything above the base price, and they've upped it again, is flowing into general revenues to be used for the NDP government's political priorities. And that's, I believe, the weakness of the carbon tax. Right. I'm not sure it's going to get us to where we need to go.
Okay. Industry, Jeff, as you and I know, one of my hats I wear is on the board of governors of CAP. So Jeff comes in and reports to us from time to time. But as you and I both know, there's some industry leaders in Alberta who've been very supportive of carbon tax. Do you know why CAP or industry in Alberta hasn't proposed an alternative that might be better?
Well, I think one of the things that we've tried to look at is there's no silver bullet. There's no policy out of there that we can just say, if it's only that one off the shelf, all our problems will be solved. And I think, again, to Ed's point, there are some things where we might, in theory or in an economic textbook, say a tax might be an efficient or maybe an effective way if applied fairly, durably, predictably across the industry. But I think what we see time and time again is government always tinkering with it or adding something that is effective and efficient, but let's put in some regulatory burden. Let's put in some facility burden. Let's continue to add complexity to the policy that at some point is counterintuitive. And it actually goes away from trying to find the most reductions at the least cost. So I think the challenge here, because our industry operates in multiple jurisdictions, not only across Canada, but around the world with various policies, we can learn to adapt if we can compete and if we can innovate. And I think the big thing is there an opportunity to grow and innovate under any kind of carbon program, whether it's a cap and trade or a regulatory regime or a carbon tax?
Okay. Mark, I know we've had lots of discussions, and I know that you're very open to alternatives, but I haven't heard you promote any alternatives. Is there a reason for that?
Well, I think the reason is there are several options that exist for reducing emissions. And obviously you've got carbon tax, you've got cap and trade, which is another form of carbon pricing, regulations, coal plant closures, fuel efficiency standards, et cetera, or subsidizing R&D. So you have all these different options that are out there. But I would say, most economists, including most of the people from the Reagan and Bush administrations, would say actually the most efficient and effective, the least cost path to the greatest emissions is actually a carbon tax. That if you have a carbon tax and get rid of regulation and recycle the revenue, that is the most efficient path. But the politics of it make it very difficult often to get that most efficient path, because the government will often want to layer more regulations on top or won't return the revenue. So really the question is, how do we get to that, what British Columbia had for 8 years, where they basically had the textbook example? How do we actually lock that in place and don't lead to a kind of a kludgy mix of all four, which is what we've ended up with?
Okay, well, just before we start, but is it the most efficient way or not? What are the alternatives? And I did some research over the years since our debate, and I'm going to list the ones that I know of, and then I'd be interested if you guys have any others. But the one I mentioned before is the approach of a border adjustment tax, which is still carbon pricing. And just to make that in layman's terms, the current idea of taxing local carbon would be analogous to the manufacturing processing tax we used to have, which taxed local production but didn't tax foreign imports and didn't give us a rebate if we exported. A border adjustment tax would still price carbon, but like the GST, would make sure we tax at the border, and we also give a rebate at the border to make sure that we're even playing field. So that's one option, and we did discuss that last year. You brought one up, which is mandate regulation, which is building codes and so on and so forth. Which is one option. We can just have the government tell us how to reduce our carbon. There's another one which we've applied successfully, which is mandated targets. So don't tell you what the building code will be, tell you what the emissions of the building must be, or tell you what the emissions per kilowatt should be, but let industry figure out how to do it. And I just want to bring up, because I think we keep saying conservatives don't like regulation, but I know there's conservatives in this room who even want to regulate marriage, so it depends on the regulation.
That was the other session.
Yeah.
So, but I would say that an example that's been enormously effective for emissions is the EPA average fleet limits, where they set a limit and they let industry figure out how to meet it. Navius has put out research behind this kind of idea, and so I think I've never heard that as an option. What about regulating targets and let industry figure out how to meet it? The fourth one is doing nothing until our trading group comes along. This is the European approach that all of Europe went together. And the final one and Aaron Toole talked about this in the last election, is incentive-based approaches. I think Scott Moe started to touch on this as well, which was a conservative alternative, is incentive-based approaches, which could be a combination of not regulation, but actually targeted deregulation for people that are doing good things, targeted tax cuts for people who have advantages in carbon, and finally the clean tech credits, which I think you referred to. So I'll ask the first question. That's my research for the year. Does anybody know of any other or sort of mainstream policy options besides the one I've mentioned?
Well, I guess geoengineering, you can try to
Change the atmosphere.
change the atmosphere, exactly.
Yeah.
But in terms of reducing emissions, I think that's pretty much the list.
There's variations on the theme, like performance standards you're talking about for industry, and looking at output-based pricing and as a way to set levels for industry performance in terms of energy efficiency and emissions based on industry standards that are set, that are practical, realistic, and they're developed by government with industry. A variation on the performance standard. The question, though, is to what extent each of these is sufficient on their own or adequate to get the kinds of emission reductions that we're trying to achieve. We should be doing this for a reason. I don't think the reason should be the price. I think it should be the price is just part of the mechanism. The objective is to reduce emissions. So we should be looking at those measures for those sectors that are emitting and find the right measures that work for that sector. So in some cases, government regulation, sense of energy efficiency standards, for example, work better. Fuel efficient cars, they're not mandated by a price signal. And to some extent, maybe if the price goes way up, then SUV sales will drop for a couple of months or something and then come back again. They're North American integrated fuel efficiency standards. So that's because that sector responds better to that. So there's a pragmatic way of looking at this. And so you take your list, Michael, and then almost like which ones work better in certain sectors to get the outcome, to get the kind of goal. And I think that can be a basis for a good conservative plan to, to go forward, because we then find a way that it works.
Okay.
I would like to suggest conservation initiatives.
Yeah.
I asked Michael earlier, and I've asked government officials at committee, do you know what our net greenhouse gas emissions are in Canada? So you take our industrial emissions, other emissions, and then you offset them with natural sequestration, whether it's forests or grasslands or something like that. No, they had no answer. Has any science been done on that? None. So we don't even know that basic information that we really need to know. What are Canada's net emissions? What do we actually contribute to the global emissions environment? And I know there's a lot of work being done to try to identify, for example, the role that forests play in sequestration. Older forests, younger forests, what do we do when we cut them down? You've got stored carbon in the wood. Do we move towards more wood construction? When you look at wetlands and grasslands and farmlands, are there ways of improving our management of those resources to sequester more carbon? And for example, farmers, they know this stuff. They know that low-till or no-till methods of agriculture actually can improve the quality of the soil with no reduction in outcomes. And so I would throw it out to you that this is an area that needs a lot of research. The federal government has not done the research. We're calling upon the government to do that research so that we at least know the true target that we're expected to meet.
Well, I want to tell you right now that this official list for the conservative movement on the options that we're going to discuss that I've got right here, I just added one to it called conservation measures and carbon sinks, but it comes down to that we've now got an agreed list. There's at least 7 options, one of which carbon pricing, which can be cap and trade or carbon taxes, 7 different options which could be looked at either as an either-or list or a smorgasbord list.
Yeah, I wouldn't see it as options in the sense of it's one or the other. I mean,
Yeah,
in
that's
some
what it would
cases,
be, a
I think
smorgasbord
it
list
has to be a coherent, cohesive approach.
Agreed.
And I think that's what industry would look for, and that there is no one size that fits all. Could we have a portfolio of options that find cost-effective ways that work for our operations? To your point, I mean, a lot of oil and gas operations are large facilities, and so you can't have just a simple price signal that, for a consumer, I'm going to use a little bit less today. And technology and the application and the development of technology is very lumpy. You don't get an incremental 2% every year. So finding technology that could work, I think works under, if you set a big target and you set an appropriate timeline, and then have industry develop technology and invest in that for the long term. But I think it asks us, it forces us to say, what's the question here? Is it really just about punishing industry and putting costs onto industry? Or is it really about an industrial policy that says, look, we want to reduce emissions at the same time that we can continue to develop, grow, and build our industry?
So, I mean, I want to push back a little bit on the smorgasbord of options, because if you have a smorgasbord of options, you have, this regulation on the steel sector and this regulation on fleet vehicles and this, program to encourage farmers to set aside wetlands. You actually end up with a much less efficient system. Whereas if there's a price that is known and predictable, and you know where the price is going to be in 5 years and 10 years, then technology is going to adapt to that price, and you can actually get rid of a lot of the regulation, which is the beauty of, I think, relying on carbon pricing as your primary tool. There are some places where it doesn't work, but carbon pricing really is the as close to the silver bullet as you get. Whereas we do have that mixture of all these different kinds of regulations right now, and that's what you see in Ontario with the Green Energy Act. That's one kind of regulation put on top of another. It doesn't work nearly as well as a simple price mechanism.
Yeah, what I presented it was to respect what David had mentioned, which was that you could mix and match your policy options. All I was saying is I think we feel we've got a pretty complete list of options, and whether you go to one as a primary or use a smorgasbord, I wasn't opining which was the right answer. I just was mentioning those were the options. But that allows to switch into maybe a discussion about and what it really means, we should be having pluses and minuses of every one of these options discussion before we make a decision, in my view. But let's talk now just pluses and minuses on carbon taxes. And I'm going to go to a point you brought up about the diminishing returns as you increase the rate. And so the Trottier report, which is largely what the Liberal government is basing its policy options on, it estimated that in line with what you're saying, the carbon tax required to meet the Paris objectives is $1,000 a ton. And the Trottier report itself said, well, that's not even possible, so let's go for $300 a ton. We now know the Liberal government from documents are leaked is aiming for $200. But their solution then was, well, we'll have a $300 a ton carbon tax. The other $700 a ton worth of work we need to do, we'll do by other things like this, mandated regulations, et cetera. So what's your, I haven't heard anybody disagree with the Trottier report. What's your guys' thoughts on that?
Well, in Manitoba, we wrestled, per se, with that report, but with that construct. We were dealing with a federal government that was bringing in, I'm going to impose this $50, up to $50, starting at 10, going to $50 a ton carbon price. We did the research, we did the modeling. It didn't make sense for Manitoba's energy economy. To get the Canadian target equivalent of -30 from 2005 levels by 2030, to get that kind of a reduction effort in Manitoba would require, it's in our plan, our document, a price of about $230 a ton. It didn't make sense. Why? Because Manitoba's already clean, renewable energy, hydro, et cetera. So we had to find something that makes sense to us, which is why we are opposed to the imposition kind of approach of the federal government on this. We are okay with doing something that works to the right context for Manitoba. So we looked at and came up with $25 a ton, and modeling that, using the same forecast, the same approach that Environment Canada does, we actually get 80,000 more tons of emission reductions, more, let's get that again, underlined, more emission reductions with our price at starting at 25 and keeping it for the 5 years at 25 than we would if we had gone to the federal price. Why would we go to the federal price? Costs more, gets less. What the hell kind of a bumper sticker is that? I mean, what does that do? I mean, it doesn't make sense. So that took us down a pragmatic path of what are the other measures that match, that can get us emission reductions within our energy economy, within the reality of Manitoba. So we chose this approach. We should be allowed to choose that approach, and we said that to the federal government, and we will resist. I presume the current government will resist that on the basis of the last conversation with that kind of, if going to $50 a ton, because it doesn't make sense. But the carbon price is the central piece. But then we have other measures, including, I'm glad you raised that, Ed, about looking at sinks and carbon removals, where the University of Winnipeg is doing some good groundbreaking research, literally, so to speak. And I encourage you to use some of that. And we're trying to find ways to measure that and take advantage of it, sort of an all-encompassing kind of approach. So you shouldn't start with the price. I guess if I had to sort of that's what that report seems to say. You got to have this price, et cetera. I get the value of it, and I agree with Mark, it is a more efficient way to do it, generally speaking, in an economy. But then you got to match it to the circumstances. And so,
well, that's what we're driving at, because of course this is the everybody knows that point. Everybody knows it's the most efficient way. So I'm just looking. Well, let's look at the reality of how it actually works. And we've got 25 years experience in Scandinavia, and we have what limited amounts of study in Canada, like Trottier report. But if it takes $1,000 a ton to meet our targets, where's the justification that it's efficient?
I mean, the numbers that there's Mark Jacquard or Navius, Enviroeconomics, these firms, they say sort of $200 a ton by 2030 to get the 30% by 2030 target. So if $1,000, that may be for the sort of 2050 target, but $200 a ton by 2030. And that sounds like a very big number, and it is a big number. But it would be about 50 cents a liter on gasoline. But the flip side of that is you could have massive reductions in corporate personal income tax, HST, across the board. So if you could have 10% personal and corporate income tax and 2% HST, I think a lot of people would take that trade. They just don't necessarily trust that government will actually do that. And there's competitiveness issues which have to be dealt with whether it's border adjustment or output allocation or something like that.
Okay. Ed, you did a talk on the Conference Board report, which just came out in the last year, and they modeled what a $200 a ton carbon tax would achieve, and it was nothing like 30%, according to them. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I had a good chance to read the Conference Board report. It's a very good report. And it, of course, maps out what I believe 8 different pathways. Each pathways makes certain assumptions about what kinds of tools will be used. But at the bottom line is, firstly, that the carbon tax will have a relatively minor impact on reducing Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. The second thing I took from it is that there's got to be infrastructure investments made over time. And some of the pathways actually required somewhere in the order of $3 trillion worth of infrastructure to be put in place. Well, we know that's just not feasible within our economy. The third thing I took away from that report was the role that developing technology will play in the future in helping us to address our climate change challenges. And they made the point that you can look at existing technology that's currently in place, and it gets you so and so far, but doesn't get anywhere close to meeting our climate change targets. However, if you look at the trajectory of where research and development and commercialization of science and of technology is going, technology perhaps represents the most promising tool that we have in our toolkit to address our climate change challenges. So it does tell me that we may have to wait a few years and over time employ more effective technology across our economy to achieve our targets. And achieving our targets, let's be honest, it's going to be very difficult. The United Nations has said very clearly that based on the current Liberal climate change plan, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change, there's no way they will meet their Paris targets. Right. So we as Conservatives, we have to grapple with the issue. Are we going to be able to meet those targets without undermining our economic prosperity and health?
Does industry have a view on the efficiency of carbon taxes?
Well, I think, again, we've been operating on a price on carbon in Alberta for more than 10 years. Since 2007, Alberta's large emitters, large industrial emitters, have been paying $15 a ton. And we did that without the need for economy-wide carbon tax that put a price on everything for everyone. So I think that we can find a way to adapt, but I think 2 things are really needed. One, if we have targets, then we need 3 things. We need time, we need technology, and we need some sort of tariff or price signal that says over time. And the higher the price that you have, the shorter the time that you're going to have to develop the technology to adapt. So you just have to live with the consequences of the disruption that it will have to the economy. Right. So in terms of industry, we can adapt to whatever price is put on or whatever regulation, but we need those 2, if you're going to give us a price, we need time and technology to be able to adapt. Otherwise, it's just going to put people out of work.
Just on the target stuff, I mean, we should, Ed makes a point about the current government's targets. They were the previous government's targets too. Yeah. And it reinforces, kind of a targetitis sickness that governments have had. Like, oh, we need a target to do this to show, well, we really mean, this time we really mean it, et cetera. And no government meets the targets. And that leads to cynicism and disillusionment. It creates uncertainty in industry. It's just all the wrong kinds of signals. So we have to rethink the way that we do that. And so we shouldn't just, cavalierly sort of dismiss targets, but we should actually perhaps do something a little more ground up, talk about the way to do this, but the end game still has to be emission reductions. I mean, why are we doing this? It's for a healthier environment. We can do this in a way, and we need to find the way to do it while still growing the economy. They're not mutually exclusive. Right. They can't be. But the target stuff has, in my view, distracted, and we didn't put a target in Manitoba. For our plan, we're going to come up with something for what we're calling carbon savings accounts over 5 years, a cumulative emission reduction, not where we should be at a certain point, but we make progress incrementally each year and we add it up over 5 years because it's the cumulative crap that's going up into the atmosphere that's causing the problem. So we got to think about where that is going. So every ton of carbon we reduce today is better for the environment overall. But the artificial target stuff, that is too much of a stretch. What do we get? Policy paralysis, political brinksmanship one way or the other, and we end up with very little in terms of progress. So we're all guilty of it to some degree. We got to find a way to work through that. And so Ed makes an important point about how that is freezing some of our approach. But we still got to have something that focuses us on the environmental outcome, which is more emission reductions.
Okay, last point on the efficiency. Sweden and Norway, I think maybe Finland as well, but definitely Sweden and Norway put $150 carbon tax in 1992. So in today's dollars, probably something like the $200 to $300 that we're talking about. Statistics Norway's report is we're surprised at a relatively high price of carbon, how little impact it's made on carbon use in Norway. The professor of chair of energy at HEC in Montreal says, after studying the impacts of carbon pricing in Quebec and the California experiment, that the only point of carbon pricing is to send a moral signal that the use of oil and gas is wrong because it doesn't really make an impact on emissions. So based on that experience and these reports and study, I'm lost where we get. I get the theory of it, by the way, I actually agree with the theory, but then I look at what's happened in practice. 25 years of history in Scandinavia. Even your point, if you go over much over $30, it doesn't make much difference. Where do we get the idea that in the real world it really is efficient?
I would challenge that to some extent. I mean, Norway sequesters almost all of the emissions from its offshore oil and gas development underground, and they have about 20-30% penetration of electric vehicles. So it actually has had, I mean, it may not have had as much of an effect as they were hoping for, but there are dramatic changes in both industrial practice and consumer behavior in Norway as a result of their high carbon price. So
Statistics Norway seems like a pretty balanced.
Sure, I'm not saying that the reductions haven't been as great as they'd hoped. But if all those emissions were not being sequestered and everyone was driving SUVs, their emissions would probably be double what they are today. So you have to look at what the trajectory was, not just the net result.
Getting to policy options, the 300% tax on cars and zero tax on electric vehicles may have nothing to do with the carbon tax, right? But the being able to park for free downtown with an electrical vehicle and the ability to charge for free and the ability to use the fast lanes. Because all of my Norwegian friends, where our company's listed there, all of my Norwegian friends, I bought an electric car because I didn't have to pay the tax and I got downtown faster.
Sure, but that's responding to market incentive. It's not the carbon tax, but it's another.
Right.
It's another.
That's all I was distinguishing. Is you're right, but
that's incentive based.
Right. Yeah. Which gets into one of the other things on this list, right? Okay, so just to change that, I'd like to talk about the regulation issue. That carbon taxes, you were saying it could end up with less regulation, but what we've seen so far with the federal government is 500 pages of new regulation that they've introduced in their carbon tax bill. And what I've seen in the Alberta Climate Plan is that the author of that in the report itself said, well, we understand that the cost of compliance with the regulation is too high for anybody who's a small emitter, which they mean really anybody smaller than Suncor or Cenovus. So how do we get all we're seeing so far is increased regulations. Where do we get to the decreased regulations?
By the way, that is a good point, which was reflected in some of the concerns that were raised with the recent tabling of the new Environmental Assessment Act amendments. They add additional regulations and red tape to the process of getting approvals for resource projects. And one of the complaints I've heard from industry is that, listen, maybe the big guys can actually comply with all of this, but the medium and the small size producers are going to have great difficulty being able to carry the cost and expense of trying to meet all of these regulations. It's extremely difficult for smaller companies to actually, first of all, understand the regulatory regime under which their projects are taking place, and secondly, actually complying with them.
Right. CAP's grappling with this issue exactly right now because suddenly it's gone from theory to practice. It's in front of the board of directors of CAP right now. What are we doing with these OBAs or output-based allocations, free allocations, whatever we call them, but OBAs in Alberta? What are we going to do? And it hasn't quite landed the way we thought, has it?
No, it hasn't. And I think one of the most frustrating things with Alberta was not only just that there was a tax and then there was an emissions limit for one sector, for the oil sands sector. Now we've seen output-based, the OBAs. The so-called carbon competitiveness incentives in Alberta. We've seen methane regulations on top of that. There's a stacking of cost and complexity here that is making it very difficult for industry just to keep pace of the magnitude of the change. And I think that's one of the things that's very frustrating is that none of this seems durable. So is this going to last us for 10 years and we can plan for it? And if there are changes, are they politically driven or are they actually market driven? We've not seen anything that's market driven. it's all politically charged. So today's rules will be changed next week or 18 months from now. So it's very hard for us to kind of make investments and understand, just when we understand one rule, something new gets added in. So I think we got to come back to, is all of this going to help us actually reduce any emissions? What's it going to do to incent us to develop technology to reduce emissions, use less energy, so we can actually sell and trade and export that energy? And is it going to keep us competitive? Because again, none of this is done in isolation. You know, whatever policies Alberta or the government of Canada put in, they're not in isolation. It doesn't stop at the border. The capital investment and or the carbon can find other ways to go to other jurisdictions. And I think that's the grave concern. Again, none of this is just done in isolation. We have to look at, it's not done in a vacuum. It's done in a marketplace where things can move.
Is that where we maybe get to less regulations if the United States were to adopt this too, that we wouldn't have to worry about all the complexity of output-based allocations, which to me just looks like a proliferation of regulation, but is that where we might get in the future to lower regulations?
If the U.S. had either carbon tax or cap and trade, and Canada would obviously go along with that, then we could get rid of regulations dramatically. I mean, the Clean Power Plan in the U.S. is the equivalent of about a $30 ton carbon tax. So a $30 ton carbon tax, no Clean Power Plan. $80 ton carbon tax, coal doesn't make any sense economically, so coal is gone. So I mean, my view, and I completely agree, that the layering on top of price and regulation is demoralizing and politically unstable. I think what we need is really, there was an implicit agreement that if there's carbon pricing, then there'll be sort of social license for business, for pipelines, for projects, and that clearly hasn't happened. And I think what we need is a kind of a grand bargain. I mean, we've had, with healthcare in this country, big disagreements between federal and provincial governments of different stripes about federal standards, about how much money was going in, and they sat down and they hammered out a 10-year accord, and it was binding. And I think we need something like that on energy and the environment, where federal and provincial governments, maybe including oppositions, sit down, hammer out a deal and say, okay, here's the price, but by the way, pipelines are going through if they're approved by the NEB, and by the way, these regulations are coming off, and it's binding on all parties. And I think we have an energy strategy, we have a climate strategy, but they're sort of grand principles, but very little that's binding except the federal carbon tax backstop that they're bringing in. But we need all of these things to be equally binding, that the trade-offs are explicit and upfront, and everyone knows what they're getting, what they're losing.
They did do that in a sense in Norway, that in 1995 or 2005 when the ETS came in, they simultaneously redid all the fiscal terms on oil and gas so that it became, from the oil and gas industry, which is most of that, almost a one industry country, they were able to say, well, the government take is this because we have the grand bargain, and that has at least worked well there, given that they had no choice but to join the European Union, so that's interesting.
Yeah, and
so
we don't have that here yet because we have legitimately political differences on the issues, part of which you've taken off the table for us, right? Fairly for this conversation, but that creates uncertainty. Democracy's messy, but there it is. So you'd like political certainty and policy. Sorry, you'd like policy certainty, but you've had one change of government recently. You may have another change of government again, and but that's the democratic rules under which we labor, but in part because we don't have a political consensus on at least attacking the problem with enough of a common front where we can then differ about what's the right mechanism on it. So I think we need to clarify pricing and the regulation piece. They can coexist depending on the way the way you do it. Industry has come to us in Manitoba and said, we don't want the carbon price applied to us. We want output-based allocations and pricing. This is industry, and there's only 6 or 7 emitters of any consequence in Manitoba. So you got to find a different solution for each of them, which we're actively, that's where we left it. But that's responding to industry. They deliberately came to us. So this isn't imposing anything on them. This is them saying this is the best approach for us. So we'll have to see how that sort of nets out, but there are ways of doing it and ensuring that the trade-offs are such that you don't have this stacking and this cascade effect. It's not guaranteed, it's not perfect, but there are ways to get at it, and they're trying to be responsive.
David mentioned that there is no political consensus. I think a lot of Canadians thought there was a political consensus, as Mark pointed out, that if there was a carbon tax put in place, that critical projects of national interest would go ahead, and now we've got a trade war between Alberta and British Columbia. And I would say this as well, going back to the merits of a carbon tax. I'm a conservative. I think most of us around this circle are conservatives. Layering a tax upon a tax, layering more taxes on Canadians is not a conservative principle.
Right.
And it's something we should stay away from, especially when, in practice, the application of that carbon tax is quite different than it might be in theory.
Okay, I'm going to exercise my prerogative as moderator to just give us about a 3-minute extension, but it's also to get your reaction to my own personal pet idea. So this is this is a public reaction to my own idea.
That's why we're
Moderator's
here.
choice. So we finally got to the point of this panel, and I'm just going to point out that this is true for Canadian aluminum. Scott Moe mentioned it's true for Canadian beans and Saskatchewan beans and lentils. It's there's a report out in Alberta that says just by putting in modern vapor control systems, we could probably save 16 megatons of carbon in Alberta. But I'm going to go to LNG as the example. But I just want to point out this is not just an oil and gas example. And if we accept, and I'll ask you for the purposes of this answering my question, accept the conference board estimates that net of leakage, a $200 a ton carbon tax will reduce 8 megatons of Canadian carbon at a price of probably so let's just go with that 8 megaton number. One big LNG plant will reduce more global carbon, much more global carbon than 8 megatons. And it will add to our economy, et cetera. So my idea is, well, what about the idea of deregulating, whether it's lentils or aluminum or LNG plants, what if we deregulate to make it easier to get them built? And what if we even gave them a tax incentive to help them get it built on the basis that that would increase the economy and do more to reduce global carbon than a $200 a ton carbon tax, assuming we accept the conference report, which I'm telling you you have to for the answer to this question.
The dilemma on it, it has merit, as long as the global calculus allows for that in Canada. So the Paris Accord does allow for something called ITMOs, internationally traded mitigation options. And that is still being sorted out as to what that means, the value of them, but that starts to fall into that territory, it seems to me. This is where certainly Saskatchewan is trying to go with carbon capture and storage. So to avoid carbon leakage, and since it is a global problem, and it is the cumulative crap, as I've talked about going up there, we don't want to ship it elsewhere. So yeah, if we can save emissions in another country, that's good for the planet, like let's get a credit for it. The Paris Accord allows for that explicitly, but it's how it's being sorted out is still a ways to go. So right now, we're all counted on our domestic reductions, domestic emissions. So even, let's take Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Clean hydro from Manitoba going to Saskatchewan, reduce the dirty coal-powered electricity generation there, reduces emissions in Saskatchewan, not Manitoba. The cost of building that or doing that would, in theory, just be Manitoba. So why would they do it? Well, maybe we could sequester some of that stuff from the coal-fired plants and electricity generation in Saskatchewan. There's actually a field in southwestern Manitoba where this could be sequestered. We could get a credit for that. So there is some, if you do something creative on that and there's some cooperation, we could find ways to balance that out. But in terms of Manitoba doing it on its own, quote unquote, why would it do it if it doesn't get any credit for the emission reduction? So we got to find a way to work through that global and national calculus problem, if you will. But I think it has merit. Of what you've talked about, absolutely.
Mark, what do you think?
I mean, in principle, if Canada's LNG or aluminum can reduce emissions elsewhere, then there should be no limitations to producing as much as we can. With LNG, if we were selling it to China and India and it's displacing coal, then we're reducing emissions. If we're selling it to South Korea or Japan, where they're pretty clean, we're not reducing emissions. We're selling to Europe, we're actually adding to emissions. So really, you have to look at not only LNG, but where it's going. But in principle, sure, we shouldn't be concerned about emissions in Canada or emissions in British Columbia or Quebec if they're reducing emissions elsewhere. But we have to make sure that they are actually reducing emissions elsewhere. Right. And what we should be worrying about is our consumer emissions far more than our production emissions.
Right. Okay.
Well, I think...
Do you agree with the LNG plants, Jeff?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is one of the concerns.
Can we get that out of the way first?
Yeah, let's just get that out of the way. Do you agree with LNG plants?
No, I think one of the concerns here is that we think too small. I mean, like your example on Quebec. We're doing geographic accounting as opposed to emissions accounting overall. And Canada's contribution to reduce emissions can be far greater than just whatever geographic accounting we do. We do have fuel opportunity that around the world Canadian oil and natural gas can displace higher sources of emitting fuels. And at the same time, we can export our technology as well. So I think that we've got to take a bigger accounting for what we do, because if we don't, we'll simply chase away investment, chase away economic development and capital. And so we'll have carbon leakage in other jurisdictions where they won't have Canadian standards and they won't have emission limits. And they will benefit from economic development that will also flee Canada. So I think we've got to find a better balance and a better way to look at a bigger picture.
Right. Scott Moe is there. What about the Federal Conservative Party? Where would you be on that kind of idea?
Well, supportive. I want to build on David's comments. He was talking about interconnectivity between provinces of electricity. British Columbia is also building a Site C dam. Alberta's right next door. We should be sharing our resources, including our electricity and our clean energy, in a way that allows Canada to reduce its own emissions without leakage happening. And you know, every time we talk about leakage, that is a competitive trade issue. It's something we haven't discussed much around the circle here, but it's something perhaps next year we'll talk about. The competitive playing field on which all of these policies are playing out. It's being tilted against Canada in North America, as you know, and in the rest of the world. We no longer have a neighbor to the south that generally shares our aspirations when it comes to climate change. They're implementing low tax policies, some regulatory changes, focus on natural gas and coal for energy, which is counter to what the direction Canada is going for the most part. And we have to be aware of the fact that if we do not have a prosperous country, higher environmental standards will not follow. They are linked. You look around the world, the countries that have the highest environmental standards are the ones that are the most prosperous. I think Canadians have to understand that. We need to understand the role prosperity plays in addressing our environmental challenges.
Great. Well, I'm going to just compliment you guys as panel members. I thought you were excellent for 3 reasons. One, we didn't have a debate; we had a discussion, which is a goal of the panel. So I'm very happy about that. The second reason I think is that there's broad agreement that looking at alternatives and the pluses and minuses does make sense. But the third and most important reason is that you all agreed on my idea, and I think that's absolutely fantastic. So thank you, and for me, could give them a round of applause.
Thank you.